Hello people, I am Ish, and one language-related topic that I find interesting is romanization, the practice of using the Latin alphabet to write other languages that already have their own writing system. The Romans, as I'm sure we all know, were a people and an empire that at one point stretched all the way from modern-day Spain to modern-day Iraq. And aside from modern-day men being unable to stop thinking about them, one of the Roman Empire's other great legacies in our time is Latin, and specifically the Latin alphabet. A lot of languages, like English, Spanish, Vietnamese, and Indonesian, are still to this day written using the Latin alphabet, which is one of, if not the most dominant writing system in our modern world. However, a lot of languages do not use the Latin alphabet, like Arabic, Thai, Chinese, and of course, my co-native Hebrew. In Hebrew, we use a writing system confusingly named the Hebrew alphabet, even though it is in fact not an alphabet but an abjad, with the main difference between an alphabet and an abjad being how you write the vowels. In the past, I've already talked about how the Hebrew alphabet deals with vowels in a previous video. But the long and short of it is that we usually just don't write out the vowels. Sometimes we add a letter like vav, our version of W, or yud, our version of Y, to hint at a vowel's existence. But mostly, we just sort of do some educated guesses. The writing systems of languages like Arabic, Thai, Chinese, and Hebrew, despite being very ubiquitous in the countries and regions where those languages are spoken, are nevertheless regarded as oddities, despite Mandarin Chinese, for example, having almost twice as many native speakers as the next language down the list, Spanish. And so, us speakers of languages like Arabic, Thai, Chinese, and Hebrew often find ourselves forced to interact with the world using the Latin alphabet. For example, my legal non-furry government name is composed of two ordinary Hebrew words. However, my passport and driver's license have my non-furry government name written in them in the Latin alphabet. And the process of deciding how to do this sort of thing is often called romanization. Now, admittedly, in my case, romanization is a relatively easy task, since my legal non-furry name is simple enough to transcribe without much of a hassle. But for some things, like the name of the Jewish holiday with the candles and the dreidels, this can prove to be a bit more challenging. I think that road signs in Israel and Palestine can serve as a good case study for this. To help non-Hebrew speakers who live or visit there, road signs are often trilingual, with Hebrew, Arabic, and Latin script all appearing side by side. However, a quick drive around the Tel Aviv area, also known as the Dan Lump, will quickly reveal our great dark secret. There is no one singular agreed upon way to Romanize Hebrew names, and sometimes, on a short 20-minute drive, you might find yourself going past several signs, all pointing to the same place, each with a different romanization of the same word. And while functionally, this is usually not much of a problem, it has always greatly bothered me personally. And I mean, look at this. Does the letter K stand for kaf or kuf? Does Z stand for zayin or tzadik? When you see an apostrophe, is that an ālef or an ayin? And when there used to be a shva na after the first consonant, do we add an e or not? This was clearly designed in such a way as to personally and specifically spite me. Bearing witness to these wacky and inconsistent romanizations around me, I found myself often fantasizing about a unified, romanized orthography for the Hebrew language. Perhaps one created as part of a utopian society, ushering in a new republic with equal rights for all and the end of all hostilities between the peoples and nations of my home country. A dog can dream. Now, ushering in a new age of peace and prosperity is slightly above my pay grade. However, what I could do was come up with a consistent romanization of the Hebrew language. one that maps each of the different Hebrew vowels and consonants to specific Latin characters, with a one-to-one matching that allows us to fully de-Romanize the word afterwards back into the original Hebrew script, while keeping all of the nuances and morphology of the original text. Obviously, I was hardly the first person who tried to embark on this fool's errand. And maybe an opinion piece on other forms of Hebrew romanization could be an interesting future video. But for today, we'll focus on my silly creation, which I decided to give the cutesy and silly and ignorant name ktav mà'ערâv, the writing of the West. I'd originally come up with this system over a decade ago, in the shiny, halcyon days of the early 2010s, when fantasizing about a better world had not yet become impossible. And I documented my original ideas in an Apple Pages document that is by now completely lost to failing hard drives and recycled computers. But nevertheless, over the years, I continued to use it sporadically in my day-to-day life, and slowly optimized it through grueling trial and error. In fact, I probably still have some notebooks filled with worries about old relationships and one-night stands and mental health issues, written partially or entirely in ktav mà'ערâv, each of them with a slightly different variant as I would develop the finer points of the system. But throughout it all, some key points almost always remained. First off, I wanted the system to be unambiguous relative to Hebrew script, so it doesn't merge anything that the Hebrew alphabet doesn't merge. Second, I wanted every letter of this system to be fully typable using my Mac laptop, which had the keyboard set to US International ABC Extended. And lastly, I wanted to not have to know by heart what each word's vowel markings are. The unambiguity part is pretty important because if we want a romanization system to be any good for Hebrew, it needs to distinguish between things like chet and chaf, or tet and taf, or sin and samech. Modern Hebrew has a lot of letter pairs that used to sound different and now sound the same, but still to this day have weird grammatical and morphological implications. The typability part is pretty important to me, because if I'm going to be the one using something, it damn well be usable by me. Windows users, who don't have Apple's ABC Extended keyboard, can go take some copium. And by Windows users, I am of course referring to myself in 2022 and 2023, when my primary computer was a Windows PC. The not knowing the vowel markings part is important because while Hebrew does have vowel markings, they are in fact representative not of the modern 5 vowels that Hebrew has, but rather of the 14 vowels that Hebrew used to have over 1,000 years ago. This leads to a situation where we ended up having more than one nikud symbol for each of our modern vowels. And since schools rightfully don't focus on teaching the intricacies of 900 CE Tiberian Hebrew, most people generally don't know which vowel markings go where. Now I, being what some would call a giant nerd, hyperfixated on those vowels for quite a bit, and I can sometimes give a relatively good guess as to what a given word's proper vowel markings might be. But I still find myself having to consult the good old dictionary if I want to actually add any vowel markings to a text that's longer than like a couple words. So whatever vowel symbols I choose to use for my Western script, I have to be able to use them even if all I know about Hebrew vowels is what they sound like to me as a native speaker. And well, how well did I achieve those goals? Very well, if I may say so myself. The only problem is that readability, intuitiveness, beauty, and the ability of other people to understand what the hell I wrote were never a consideration. So I have no illusions that this will ever be popular, understood, or even not hated. So, without further ado, let's dive headfirst into ktav mà'ערâv, Western script. Despite being named in the singular, ktav mà'ערâv is in fact 3 different beasts all rolled up into one. The first is a straight-up conversion of Hebrew script into Latin consonants, A text like this would simply be converted letter by letter into this eldritch horror. This is, it ain't pretty. However, since I included a sentence at the bottom there that contains every single letter of the Hebrew alphabet, this example does at least allow us to discuss the choices and compromises I had to make in coming up with the consonants. I like to think that most of these consonant choices are pretty self-explanatory. B for bet, G for gimel, D for daled, H for hey, and so on. Some of them are a bit more questionable, but still understandable, like S with a hot check for shin, or Q for kuf, or X for chet, or T with a horizontal bar for tet. After those come the outright confusing choices, like C for tzadik, W for vav, and an apostrophe for ayin. And finally, the inexcusable sin of choosing to use the vertical pipe bar for ālef. The ālef choice will hopefully become more excusable and less sinful in the next step, but let me take a moment to explain the others first. B for bet, P for pay, and K for kaf might seem like an obvious choice at face value, but keen-eyed viewers will notice something missing here: the non-dagesh forms vet, fe, and chaf. In this level 1 of ktav mà'առâv, these three letters, despite having two sounds each, are always written using one Latin letter each. The original thought behind this choice was to make it simple enough that a slow, clunky early 2010s computer could still hypothetically convert Hebrew script into Latin script, even without having any knowledge of any of the vowel and consonant intricacies. Next up, shin and tet. At this stage, these two might stick out like a sore thumb, seeing as no other letters have any diacritics, but this is soon to change. I just didn't want to have to use a combination of two letters like English SH or Polish RZ, because that would hurt my hypothetical 2010s computer's ability to seamlessly convert this form of ktav mà'առâv back into Hebrew script, since it wouldn't be able to tell SH for shin apart from S for samech followed by H for hey. C for tzadik and W for vav and apostrophe for ayin are choices made under duress, with the rest of the Latin alphabet already starting to be taken by more and more consonants. Again, for tzadik, I didn't want to use any combinations of letters for the same reason as shin, but C already is used for the ts sound in some Slavic languages and sometimes even in German too, so it felt appropriate. W for vav was a choice I made so as to keep the letter V open to future use as the non-dagesh variant of bet, coming up soon. And apostrophe for ayin, well, it felt okay with the whole glottal stop thing. In some earlier versions, I remember considering using the Turkish G with a breve for this. But since I was already using the hachek for shin, as well as some other consonants, it felt a bit overly complicated to have both the breve and the hachek in my writing system. And finally, ālef. I haven't forgotten that one, just bear with me for now. The second variant of ktav mà'առâv, which I will be foolishly referring to as level 2, is the version of it that I most commonly use, such as in the notebooks alluded to earlier. In level 2, we lose the ability for a quick and dirty computer program to mindlessly convert existing Hebrew text into Latin script, but instead we gain something much more valuable in my O: vowels and the dagesh kal. If we take a look at the example sentences from level 1, in level 2 we get a much more manageable romanization for them. Personally, I think this looks quite elegant. The vowels are a nice addition, and most importantly, I got rid of the vertical pipe bar. Other changes of note are the addition of vet, chaf, and fe, as well as sin, gimel, daled, jain, tzadik, and thaf. These are all pretty self-explanatory, I think, but the ālef situation might require some more explaining. In a word where the ālef glottal stop consonant comes before a vowel, we write a horizontal line over the vowel in question, like in the words eze, al, mà'առâv. On my keyboard, I can do this by pressing Option A and then typing the vowel. In words where an ālef comes after a vowel, or is used as a mother of reading to hint at a vowel, we write a horizontal line under the vowel in question. Bati, rosh, dugma. This is still typable using the macOS ABC extended keyboard. You type the vowel and then Option-Shift-H for the combining character. Any words that have an ālef between vowels get a horizontal line over the second vowel. Te'ura, ma'amina, she'ilta. I think that this is a perfectly serviceable solution to this conundrum, and it kind of answers the question of why level 1 ktav mà'առâv uses the vertical pipe bar for ālef. This system also lets us distinguish between words that do versus don't have a glottal stop. Glula mara mul mar'a. We can clearly tell that the two words spelled M-A-R-A in this phrase are different words. One of them has an ālef before the A sound. And with a contrived, tricky, poetic example, like this one, level 2 ktav mà'առâv actually allows us to have less ambiguity than the original Hebrew script. I may be one to sometimes toot my own horn, but still you gotta admit, this is pretty cool, right? And finally, we get to level 3 ktav mà'առâv. This third echelon of Western script is not something designed for normal everyday use, especially not for an entire text, but rather as something between an experiment and a way to disambiguate words. As I mentioned before, modern Hebrew still retains the vowel marks it used to have over 1,000 years ago, which far outnumber the actual vowels we use in our spoken language at this point. But they still carry some limited significance in religion, in grammar, and in general nerdiness. My idea for level 3 ktav mà'առâv was to try and create diacritics for the vowels that would encompass the full gamut of the 14 original vowel marks. I tried to use the circumflex for long vowels, the grav for short vowels, and the double grav for ultra-short vowels. The schwa, being special at all, got its own diacritic in the form of the dot above, and the kamatz katan is always a mess, so you can choose whether or not you want to use a different diacritic or vowel for it. Consonants with a dagesh, if they're not at the beginning of a word, can be represented with the dot above as well, which requires a combining character to type some of them. So the two example sentences from before have now become this. Alright, let's be honest. This is a Unicode abomination beyond our wildest nightmares. Like, this is giving bad conlang vibes. I rate it 0 out of 10. I put it in F tier. Totes cringe, mid. No, skibbity dr. And yet, I can still imagine uses for this. Or something, I don't know. I mean, this ocean of diacritics is there for a reason. The last time that all of these 14 vowels were actually all distinct from each other was probably like 1,000 years ago. And these days, all that really matters is just the 5 vowels. A, E, I, O, U. My idea here was that if I choose to write a vowel letter with no diacritic, then I can send the message of being completely unopinionated or ignorant or indifferent about which 10th century vowel it used to be once upon a time. But if for some reason I do care, then I can make the effort and put a little schmitchik over it. This also means that you can write out your entire text in level 2 ktav mà'առâv, with no diacritics on the vowels except the ālef bar over and under, and only add in some extra spiciness once in a while to disambiguate a word. But then, what word would even need this kind of disambiguation? I sure as hell haven't found one yet, and not for lack of trying. And still, I do feel like this was a nice little experiment to see how far I could sort of stretch the Latin alphabet to fit the needs of the Hebrew language. And now, let's get into the fun part, edge cases and rules! You may have noticed in some of these examples that there are no final H's, even though those words do end with a hey in the Hebrew alphabet. This is a deliberate choice I made when coming up with ktav mà'առâv, in an attempt to make it slightly less cluttered. Since it's extremely common for words ending in the vowels a and e to have a silent hey at the end, I decided that as a policy, you simply don't write it in those cases. Words that end with an ālef get the bar under the vowel, and words that end with an ayin get the apostrophe. The one instance where you have to put a hey at the end of a word is when the silent hey hints at a vowel that is not a or e. And an instance where you can optionally put a hey at the end of a word is when it has a mapik in it. If you're really fancy, you can even add a dot over it. All of this means that in ktav mà'ערâv, the holiday with the donuts and the latkes is spelled with no final H. One problem that this no final H rule poses is with some masculine singular endings of verbs and possessives, like in these words. Currently, my favorite solution to this problem is
don't worry about it.
But other potential ways to solve this conundrum might include, for example, making final H mandatory if the previous consonant was taf or chaf. Doing this would introduce a weird inconsistency into the system that I'm not too fond of. Another solution I thought of at some point would be to add another diacritic for this case, which I am also not a fan of because it introduces yet another diacritic into the system. I'm currently just okay with
Nah, it's fine, don't worry.
But who knows, at some point in the future I might decide that it actually bothers me enough that I'll try to find a solution for it. Another edge case, which I already nonchalantly showed in one of the previous examples, is what's called the patax gnuva. When an ayin or a chet at the end of a word has an a vowel right before it, it gets written as two adjacent vowel letters with an apostrophe or x after them. This shouldn't create any ambiguity that I can find, because if these two adjacent vowels were to have an ālef between them, the second of the two vowels would have had a horizontal bar over it. Also, if we're doing the level 3 bad conlaying ultradiacritics mode, the ālef's horizontal bar goes above any of the vowel length diacritics. And an ālef bar under a vowel, of course, goes undisturbed. And finally, something that I keep going back and forth on is the long e vowel. When I first came up with the experiment that would eventually become ktav mà'ערâv, I originally toyed with the idea of having the long version of this vowel be a kind of a shorthand for a combo of the short vowel plus a consonant, kinda sorta like the חיריק מלא in Hebrew script. The main reason that I liked doing this little trick was that then some words could be written with just two adjacent vowels and without the letter Y. Currently, I'm at a point in my life where I don't like this, because I recognize that I can't fully comprehend the weird 10th century vowel and gemination implications that this decision would have. But I do have to admit that it has a certain aesthetic charm to it. So, in conclusion, this was a cool thing that I made, and I hope that you liked it. And if you have any ideas or comments or questions or compliments, you can leave those in a comment below. And if you enjoyed watching this video, you can press the like button. And if you didn't enjoy it, you can go f*** yourself. Oh, also subscribe, or don't. Whatever.